Hello, folks. This is Gender in Focus, a podcast exploring how to create a more inclusive world for trans and non binary people. I'm your host, Kai Scott, and I use the pronouns he and him. I'm the president of Trans Focus Consulting. Each week, I dive into real stories and expert advice, offering practical tips and actionable takeaways to help you lead with kindness, confidence, and heart. Tune in to discover how you can make a positive difference. It's just a conversation away. In today's episode, I'm joined by a very special guest, Finn Liu, a fellow TEDxer. We survived to tell the tale, so we'll dive a little bit into that. But we're here to talk mostly about Finn's experiences as a transgender Chinese Canadian, especially important as we celebrate Asian Heritage Month. We're going to explore the many layers of authenticity, belonging, and understanding. Welcome, Finn, to the pod. It's really good to reconnect with you here today. Would you just please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, of course. It's great to see you again as well. So, my name is Finn. I'm currently a first year student at the University of Pennsylvania. I did TEDx with Kai like 2 years back now. It feels
Mhm.
like it was yesterday, but also forever,
Yeah.
And right now I'm studying political science and criminology with the hopes of attending law school in the future.
Mhm.
Um, in my high school years, I spent a lot of my time doing a lot of volunteering, exploring a lot of personal passions and interests. But I also, I guess, a big part of my identity is that I happen to be transgender and also Chinese. So I thought that that was an intersecting aspect of my identity that I wanted to speak about, which is why I eventually went on TEDx. But I'm really happy to speak here today.
Oh, that's amazing. And I'm so glad you did that too. It was so important, the themes that you unpacked, even in a very short window. I mean, we're packing in, so much into 10 minutes. It's kind of incredible.
Yeah,
And I just thought it was really poignant. And not that we're going to only talk about your TEDx, but I think it's a good
sure, yeah.
place to start. uh, is just this really powerful concept or even imagery that you used by referencing the language. And it's the concept of qua, which means to leap. And so I thought if you could start with that, just explaining that a little bit more and, why you framed or used some of your framing around that concept, which I thought was so
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah, of course. I'm surprised that like 16-year-old me was able to put that together. But
Very impressed.
thank you. But I think like a big part of my brainstorming when it came to writing that TED Talk was thinking about areas about my identity that I felt like were disconnected. And a big part of that was language, because even though I speak Mandarin fluently because I grew up speaking it with my parents, there were definitely terms, vocabulary, and things that were difficult to talk about. So I was wondering how Mandarin Chinese in of itself speaks on identity. And a part of that is looking at the literal word for transgender in Mandarin, which is 跨性别, which literally means like crossing or to leap between gender. And I thought that that was interesting because like it when I first heard it, it sounded really like strong, right? It sounded like it's insane, like you're taking a leap. Like that's pretty cool. But I mean, a lot of like older Chinese generations and also a lot of Chinese mainstream media, like still in the modern day, like do not look very favorably upon queer and BIPOC individuals. So I was thinking of like why if language in of itself gives this like feeling of strength, why we still feel disconnected, even though the identity in itself is like talking about connection, or at least that's just how I interpreted it. So I really wanted to bring light onto that as like a starting point, I guess, for conversation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense to start with language because there's a familiarity, there's the being able to access that and to be able to reconceptualize it, to
Yeah,
shift the way that from one understanding to another by starting with language. And I thought that was so beautiful. But then also the self empowerment piece, the self
for
determination
sure.
aspect
Yeah.
of it. Uh, and connecting it to an experience that either your parents or people in your family would have had of going to what is not necessarily kind of a new place, especially when it
Mhm.
comes to being trans, but certainly the kind of going into the unknown and
Yeah.
not knowing what's on the other end, but still excited, still determined to go and take that step, which takes a lot of effort, but is still worth the journey.
No, for sure. That's
Yeah.
why I thought it was interesting too, because like I thought of a connection between, I guess, the word for trans in Mandarin with like, like immigration or like other things
Mhm.
that my parents' generation, a lot of people within their generation have taken, in their own leaps of faith, which I thought connected in some ways. So maybe there can be like a shared understanding if we kind of share those struggles.
There's oftentimes I try to talk about empathy bridges, right? So
Mhm.
sometimes people really can't connect to trans and non binary experiences. But if you start to break things down in terms of things that they can relate to and draw parallels, they can often be kind of take that extra leap, a qua of their own in understanding and be able to get to it. But it does take breaking those things down. And certainly I can appreciate that you've had to have those conversations and help people along on that, and also on the stage with a broader audience to
Yeah.
help them with that understanding.
Yeah, that was nice too because like I
Yeah.
remember later in the year, or like I think it was actually just last year, I was at a Model UN conference and like
Hmm.
someone like pointed me out and like started up a conversation with me and told me that like she actually watched my talk with her mom and it helped them understand, like
Wow.
helped her mother understand more about like queer identity. So like I don't know, it's just like those little moments that I mean I obviously I rarely have them, but like whenever I have,
Hmm.
it just made me remember how valuable it was to share everything. And I really like that makes me feel really like happy and joyous inside.
Oh yeah, and it's so powerful to take that step of being really visible, because
Mhm.
of course being on a TEDx stage is a degree of hyper visibility
Yeah, everyone's looking at
that
you. Yeah.
the thousand people in the audience, and then
Yeah.
later on online as well. And so I don't know if you want to share a little bit about that visibility
Mhm.
aspect, and you making that choice, seeing as there's a tremendous value and importance in talking about yourself, like talking and seeing, so that others who have that experience can also perhaps make that decision for themselves in terms of stepping up, maybe not on a TEDx stage, but certainly within
Mhm.
their own lives.
Yeah, for sure. So I feel like when I was giving my talk, I really wanted it to be more of just like a call to witness because I
Mm,
feel like I never really saw people looking like me growing up on media, especially
mm,
not someone who's like queer and also Asian, which I think is something that you just rarely see in general.
mm.
So I really wanted to like put myself out there, even though it was definitely scary because I had been out for like around almost 2 years at that point, but I just really wanted to
Wow.
make a statement. I wanted other youth, especially, to be at least more comfortable in seeing themselves on screen, right? Because I was
Mm,
thinking, like, even though it is very difficult to, bridge generational perspectives and talk to your
mm,
parents, come out, like, go through all those barriers, I thought it was really valuable that someone at least was able to see themselves and see that they're represented regardless of where that might be. And it just happened that I got the opportunity and the privilege to speak on the TEDx stage, which I thought was, like probably one of the bigger stages that I could have been visible on. So I thought that was great. I think at its core, it was really just about visibility and at least making someone comfortable in their own skin
mm.
if they, before hasn't seen anyone like them on screen.
Oh, absolutely. It's just opening that door
Mhm.
for folks to consider that, to celebrate it, to be like, oh, finally somebody is speaking the various tensions and difficulties, or even the exciting things that I uniquely experience at those intersections.
Yeah, of course.
And yeah, having not frequently or perhaps even ever seen that in such a big way. And so,
Mhm.
and also, I appreciate you doing that too, because sometimes people are like, we should do this. And then, nobody steps up, which I
Right.
understand
I
because
almost
there
backed out
is,
of the talk as well. I'll be real. Like when I was applying for it, like it was definitely
yeah,
a last minute decision because I just thought, why not? At the end of it all.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so true, because there are costs to visibility that
Mhm.
oftentimes are invisible, ironically enough, but those are so important that when people do muster up that courage to speak so openly about it, and I would say particularly because of what you were talking about, and there's many layers and themes to it, but this we don't talk about these issues, right? These are kind of personal matters that maybe you can speak to yourself about, but really we shouldn't say to others, because really we're focused. What you talked a lot about was success, like personal success,
Right. Yeah.
achievement, And so, yeah, how do you navigate that aspect?
Yeah, for sure. I think like really it came down to reflecting on what I personally wanted. I know
Hmm.
that I'm like one of those people that also just did want to achieve things and did want to like exercise my passions as much as possible. So maybe I'm like a little bit of a not the best example here, but I think for me it was about achieving the goals that I really wanted in the future, right? So regardless of whether that was trying to get into a good college, whether that was like trying to get a little bit better at playing my guitar. It was
Mm,
one of those things that I wanted to value myself in, and without, really considering what the general expectation from my culture or my parents look like. I think
mm,
once you break away from that expectation and really reflect deeply on what your personal goals and ambitions are, I think that's when you can become like a whole lot happier with where you are and also where you can see yourself being in the future.
mm, mhm. And in a way that allows you to also lean into, the fullness of who you are,
Yeah.
including embracing your heritage and who you
Mhm.
are, culturally. Sometimes they're almost pitted against each other, in
Yeah,
a
for
way
sure.
that transgender, leads somebody away from
Mhm.
being Asian, but actually being trans or being able to fully embody that then allows you to embrace everything.
Yeah.
But it takes, I'm sure, a few steps to get to that. But
No, yeah.
yeah, I don't know if you have some stories or experiences around that.
Yeah, yeah. So I definitely agree. I do feel like because Asian identity revolves a lot around community, at least in the Chinese community, it revolves a lot around like, valuing what your family thinks, valuing what your grandparents thinks, what your family thinks, and what your greater, wider community thinks. So it's
Hmm.
a lot to like bear as an individual, right? And
Uh,
this can be reflected in like politics or like Chinese society right now, where a lot of young people just don't want to marry because they don't want to marry and have the burden of like,
hmm,
being responsible and looked at by their spouse's family. So I
hmm,
definitely felt a lot of that when I was coming out, especially because I felt like I was taking too big of a leap to value my individualism over
hmm,
my community, which I think was probably one of my biggest struggles is considering like the impact that me coming out or me having this label and identity, like the impact that it would bring onto my family over
hmm,
the impact that I would feel had I not felt comfortable in my own skin, had I not come out and just like been able to express myself. So I think it was like a balance of those two things where it's first like recognizing your parents' perspective, recognizing like what your community means to you and vice versa, but also being able to value yourself and put yourself first on things that I thought mattered most, which for me definitely was my identity at the time.
hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense that you're trying to balance all these things and respect yourself, respect your
Mhm.
family, your culture, but that at some point there push does come to shove, and you're having to make those tough choices,
Yeah.
and there is a cost to them as well. Of
Mhm.
course, there's also, I'm sure, many kind of celebratory moments or poignant
Right.
moments
Yeah.
where
Of course.
you're surprised, maybe even.
Mhm.
Do you have any stories or examples of that where you were maybe pleasantly surprised?
I feel like for the most part, thankfully, I was pretty pleasantly surprised, although I felt
Mm,
like it was more neutrality than
mm,
like very terrible or like, very positive. Cause for me, like coming out to my parents, for example, it was like very much of a sit down conversation instead of
yeah.
like a big blown up argument or like whatever celebratory TikToks I've watched of people coming out to their family before, which I've watched plenty.
Mm,
um, and it was honestly it was kind of nice too because although there were definitely areas where we disagreed with, there are certain points of view that are still difficult to get across for sure, and I think that's something that you grow with over time and communicate with your family and with
mm,
your community and peers over time. There were things that we were able to like partially agree on, things like being more socially expressive with like my male gender, being able
mm,
to adopt my chosen name into my school records. Those sort of things were definitely surprises that I didn't
mm,
really think my parents would be totally okay with. And I did think that a part of it was thanks to like some, I guess, cultural norms because like for example, like
mm.
my mom also has short hair and then she I guess thought that I was a lesbian because she thought that like I maybe was expressing myself in a more masculine sense because like I like girls, which wasn't entirely necessarily the
Right.
case, right? But it's one of those things where it's like there are certain areas of expression that they didn't see as like quote unquote queer because it's pretty normalized in like
Mm,
Chinese society. We're walking down the street and you see like women with short hair, or like you see people like, you know, guys in the summer wearing like tanks, like
mm,
crops because like crop tops because like it's hot, right? I think those are like things that if we think of them in the West, we don't really consider those as very normal. But going back home to China in the summer, I realized that a lot of those gender expectations that we have here in the West may not entirely reflect back at home. So it was definitely one of those things where even if at the time they couldn't really completely accept my trans identity, they at least
mm,
accepted those areas of expression that I felt were very important to me, especially as
mm.
someone who just newly came out and want to like express myself more to my friends at school and my teachers and my like other communities as to who I am.
Wow. That's really good that there was space,
Yeah,
given some of those maybe different cultural
right.
expectations, and not related to dress or expressing oneself,
Mhm.
whether hairstyle or clothing or whatnot. And that's so fascinating that there was that spaciousness, and that you didn't have to struggle over that area. Because
Mhm.
certainly on my end, definitely clothes was a tension point
Yeah.
growing up. And so good that you didn't have to do it on there. But then there was a little bit more neutral when it came
Mhm.
to identity, which is more of an internal matter and is not maybe as
Yeah.
outwardly manifest. And so it can show up in different ways that perhaps it's harder to understand or kind of accept. But you're right that it does take time too, right? And just for people to get used to it and also to realize you're still the same person, even if things
Right.
are
That was a big
changing.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it certainly can take some time. So
Mhm.
I am curious too. I mean, there's some of the dynamics and the nuances, but and perhaps even challenges. But I'm wondering what brings you cultural joy. So
Yeah.
if it's related to food, tradition, customs, anything, in terms of your heritage, and what maybe has special meaning to you, and especially at significant moments in your life.
Of course, I'm a big food person. If you ask any of my friends, I'm always like snacking. And I guess like that's one of those things that really ties me to my family and my culture
Mm,
as well. Like I know that one of the moments that I really appreciated was making what's called zhongzi, which are these like glutinous rice
mm,
things that are wrapped with like my family uses bamboo leaves and then it's steamed and it has like dates and
mm,
beans and other things inside and it's traditionally eaten around the Dragon Boat Festival, which is like I think the fifth month on the lunar calendar. It's one of
okay.
those celebrations that you see around the time of like the Spring Festival and Chinese New Year as well. So I think it was one of those things where it's like we have a shared interest, something that we can all enjoy. But I think the biggest part of food and that connection to my culture is the fact that it allows you to sit down, right, with your family.
Mm,
It's usually what brought me to have conversations with my family because when I was in high school, for example, I was really busy with everything, school especially. So usually the only time I got to talk to my family was at dinner time. So I
mm.
think back to like a lot of those cultural connections, and it really came down to like celebrations and especially around the food that we had during those celebratory events.
Hmm. Oh, that's so beautiful. I really like that because you're right. It's in the kind of low pressure, let's just talk human to human, and maybe even very simply. But
Mhm.
that the shared thing of food is what draws everybody around the table,
Yeah,
and then that allows that conversation to unfold. And it's not going to happen at one time. It's multiple conversations with little pieces added into the mix, and yeah, I can relate to that too. In terms of with my family, it took a while for them to understand, and we committed to having regular dinners together to get to know each other better, and that really made a huge difference to have those conversations over time. So I can see
yeah,
how that be of tremendous value and importance.
yeah. And it's
Mm,
like, I don't know, it's just comforting to also be like, maybe like making food or something that you get hands
mm.
on with, something that like just brings the family together as casual, as like warm and nice, right? It's one of those moments where you feel more comfortable to talk at all or even if it's like something small.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it is the simple things at the end of the day, which I know we're talking about very big topics often when
Hmm.
it comes to trans and non-binary folks, but as much as people can kind of boil it down to the simpler moments, those are where really there's a lot of power and ability to come together and to see each other more directly. So that's
Yeah.
really kind of beautiful, and I love to hear that. Now, what are some lessons that you wish allies of trans folks would know, or even allies in Asian communities would know, or be able to better show up for folks who are trans and or Asian?
Yeah, I feel like a big thing that I hope more trans advocates or even members of the trans community see more is that we're not a monolith, right? Like
Mm,
there's a lot of other intersecting identities and a lot of other backgrounds and experiences that also impact how we experience transness, gender, coming out, all of those things.
mm,
Because I feel like one of the things that I heard really commonly when I expressed to like some friends or like allies and peers that like perhaps my family wasn't and still isn't the most accepting, even though
mm,
like they're okay with certain areas of expression from me. People are always just like, oh, but you can always just cut them out, like you can always like do
mm,
that, which I think is like a very Western perspective, because I remember like watching cartoons growing up where like once you're 18 you leave the house and that's it, right? Like your parents are glad to get you like out of the house and like that you're glad to leave. But I feel like they don't realize that with the Asian community, there's just so much like familial importance, and there's so
mm,
much community that comes from your family. So those little things like that are very important to your identity and your cultural identity intersect with how you approach coming out, for example,
mm,
or how you approach like safety or how you approach expression. So I think trans allies need to realize that we're not really all the same at all, and that oftentimes you can't just advocate for like individual liberties of the trans
mm.
community, and instead need to like recognize specific minorities and the differences that we share, and like in some ways how we can connect using those differences as well.
Mhm. Oh, that's so important. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because oftentimes folks approach coming out as this binary,
Yeah, for
which
sure.
it isn't. It is very much a spectrum with so many different options available to folks, and just appreciating that everybody has their own decision making around coming
Mhm.
out, and that it might look very different from
Yeah.
one's own personal coming out, or how, if they're an ally, they think they would handle it. And this individual, I'm an island and will go forth and boldly chart my own course. Maybe that works for some, although I would even doubt
Yeah.
that for for folks here in the West.
Mhm.
Uh, but certainly being so interconnected with family and culture and even extended family and
Mhm.
society, that just it's not something you can sever. And
Yeah, it's definitely not easy. Yeah.
yeah, and we see that even in the research that we do at Transfocus, that we've started to undertake intersectional analysis, and we find that there are unique issues that need to be identified, number one, and addressed. So one example of that was, in a university setting, what mail goes home and what name is used, and
Mm.
needing flexibility around chosen name versus legal name. And
Yeah.
so legal name might be chosen for going home, because maybe folks aren't out yet, or not fully out, or have a different type of outness. And so needing that flexibility around which names go where is a really important thing to introduce for everybody's choice and ability to navigate those nuances.
Yeah,
So
and I feel like name is another one of those things where from an outside perspective it just seems so small, right? Like
mm,
you can just switch in between if you're trying to be stealthy. But it's one of
mm,
those things that like combined with everything else that are really going through your mind on like a
mm,
day-to-day basis, like an everyday basis, it becomes very difficult. And like I
mm,
think it's one of those things when it comes to name that I actually appreciate with my Chinese identity, because my legal name is my Chinese name and I never use
mm,
that. I use an English name. So it's like when it came to changing my name on my transcripts, it's technically like my nickname or like, my
mm.
non-legal name. So there is
Yeah.
that like lack of legal barrier that I have to go through or that I want
Hmm.
to go through in terms of like changing documents with it, because I can go by my English name while also still having like my Chinese name, which is pretty gender neutral, which I
Oh,
like a lot. So it's one of those things
sweet.
that I think it's quite nice to appreciate when you come from an
Yeah.
immigrant family like mine.
Oh, that's so interesting, that those kind of the dynamics between chosen and legal first name, and
Mhm.
that essentially that stay the legal name stayed, but then there's the changing of the English name, and I mean that's why I've been in working with systems on with organizations. Basically, yes, it helps trans and non-binary folks for whom they might be changing their legal first name, but it makes sense to have two first name fields for a variety of different reasons,
Yeah.
some of which we're talking about here, but then there might be other needs. I mean, even as simple as you know Robert is somebody's legal name, but they want to be called Bob, right? So
Mhm.
just having those two first name fields allows for respectful interactions in the name that somebody goes by on a day-to-day basis. It's as simple as that, right? But
No, for
takes
sure.
a minute. Yeah.
It might take a little bit for people to get adjusted to, which I realize, but it's yeah, it's one of those things that gets better over time.
Now, I'm wondering if you have any role models. I know you were saying that you saw an absence of role models or people representation in the media of folks who are, trans and Chinese or Asian. But I wonder now, maybe things are changing, things are opening up. If there are now any role models, whether in the past or present, that you draw from
Mhm.
inspiration or at least being able to see parts of your story.
Yeah, of course. I think like even in the earlier years when I was coming out, even though there weren't a lot of representation, two people that I really kind of looked up to because I saw their YouTube videos, especially like their this is my name is this is my voice X months on T.
Right. Oh my gosh, the
Yeah,
classics.
yeah, the classics was Chella Man, who is like I think they're
Yeah.
also Chinese, and then they
Mhm,
happen to be like a disability activist,
mhm,
mental health activist, and is also a transgender man. So I thought that they're very inspirational because they're very out with their story and also with like disability advocacy as well.
mhm.
And then there was also Skylar Baylor, and he swam for Harvard actually on the
Right.
men's swimming team, which I think was one of, if not the first transgender
Mhm,
D1 athlete. I might be wrong on that, but I remember like seeing him as one of the firsts for something, and especially for like an Ivy League school, which throughout my high school years I was really aiming for.
mhm,
I thought that that was so inspirational because not only was he out, he was also like swimming, like he
mm.
was playing a sport, which I guess especially now in like American politics is a very hot button
Oof.
issue,
Yeah.
and it definitely has been for the past few years. It was really nice to see that because I was like he was very outspoken. He was like on posts a lot on Instagram, on YouTube as well,
Mm,
talking about not only his own experience but also like how he feels people should advocate for trans rights, and it's always very open and visible about that. So
right.
I really like that. I think especially seeing it as a young person too, like seeing someone who's trans who's also Asian was a very big deal for me.
Mm.
So just having like a couple of those people there, even to just like watch YouTube transitioning videos of them, that was really nice. Yeah.
It's so true. I could very much relate to that, early days where you're like, of course, you have this inner sense, and then it just feels very big. But to have somebody who's maybe a little bit further along, or even not that much further along, to be able to speak out loud some of the things that are happening and some of the unique aspects, I'm sure, for you too, where somebody is able to speak to the things that maybe like I haven't even been able to voice and put
Yeah.
together, but they're spelling it out and then living their lives too, right? It's maybe even as banal as just like, wow, they
Just being
exist.
a person, honestly, just like casually like, doing regular person things, but
Mhm.
just happening to like have a shared identity. I think that was a big deal.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and doing great things because I connect with your what you were unpacking in terms of being able to succeed, right? Just because one is trans doesn't preclude one from success. Mind you, there could be struggles along the way and perhaps
For
even
sure, yeah.
failures, uh, as you mentioned, because you're human. Um, but that. there still can be people that are striving for excellence out there. And so I don't know what your journey of excellence entails. I'm certainly studying is, I'm sure, a big part of it right now. But yeah, just if you want to speak to excellence or success and what that means to you.
Yeah, of course. I feel like once I came to college, I have like definitely slowed my pace a lot
Mm,
just to like relax a little bit because I did spend I feel a lot of my high school years chasing success
mm,
and trying to like get a lot of achievements, trying to do the best I could, get awards for whatever I was like trying to compete in, which in high school was a lot of like public speaking,
mm,
debate, um also like a little bit of sport. So it's those things that I felt like that maybe drove me to like be as successful as possible, but also I think a part of my identity was woven into that as well because I felt like I needed to overcompensate for
mm,
everything because I was trans. And I guess a part of it also came down to like the media perception of affirmative action at the time and also
mm.
DEI, which I know is another, oh, so many like there's so many hot button issues that just
I know.
happen to like affect trans
Ay,
people.
ay,
Oh my
ay.
god. But
Ugh.
yeah, it was one of those things where I felt like I didn't want people to think that I was succeeding because like I there was a quota or that
Mm,
I there's more leniency towards me and my identity, right? And it was one of those things that I had to overcome even when I got into Penn
mm.
because I felt like I was scared that people were gonna think I got in because I'm some like diversity hire, which is I
Right.
know it's like one of those things that isn't necessarily true,
Mm,
but it's one of those fears at the back of my mind,
sure.
right? So I felt like throughout high school I was just doing my best to feel like I can be credible in
Mm,
speaking and doing whatever I am doing because I felt like only if I was successful, then people could see that, I was good at what I was doing, even if like for a regular cis person, you don't have that mindset of having to overcompensate and continue like achieving so much to feel like you're good at something.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And just kind of working twice as hard to be accepted as kind of who one is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a big struggle. And but then also good to hear that you're able to kind of be like, okay, I'm in. Now I can just
Yeah.
go steady at this because you're right.
Mhm.
The pursuit of success can be all consuming in ways that
Right.
there's a lot to life, right?
Yeah.
And so much to enjoy, especially I'm sure in a new city and a new environment and whatnot. So yeah, makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, it's nice having this change of pace as well, I think,
Yeah,
because like it's I don't know, it's so weird just like shifting gears all of a sudden, but I feel like now instead of like just chasing after achievement, I'm more so just like, doing what I really enjoy and
right.
like finding those passions and like being able to take it all in instead of trying to have an ends to something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does allow you to, I imagine, be more present to really
Yeah.
great stuff that's happening, and also I find too when you're able to resonate with what you're really passionate with, then it kind of the rest takes care of itself. I mean, that sounds very woo woo, but it is very true. I've found in at least what I've pursued too, usually comes to bear, and it kind of it takes me on a journey. Um, Sometimes a very surprising one at that, but without kind of a specific outcome in mind, things can unfold as they wish. So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
really cool disposition. It is a shift, a
Hmm.
good one at that. So,
Yeah, no, definitely a good one. Yeah.
um, I'm wondering too if you could speak to kind of cultural misunderstandings that you've encountered.
Mhm.
I know you've spoken about a few of them, but if you have any others that you want to specify, where they especially discussing gender identity, and there's a lot of gender expectations, and then how that fits within the Chinese community, but even outside of the Chinese community, interacting with,
Yeah.
say, the 2S LGBTQI community. Yeah, if you want to
Mhm.
speak to any of that.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like especially within like the Chinese community and at least my family, because a lot of community members are pretty under resourced
Mm,
and don't know a lot about like, 2S LGBTQ identity, they assume that perhaps trans people like are and gender identity is very much interwoven with sexuality,
mm,
which oftentimes it may not be.
mm,
So I think it was one of those moments as well with my parents where they were misconstrued that people who are trans transition because they're gay, which I
Mm,
think was like a pretty interesting thought to have as well, considering how there's like, there are intersections between gender and sexuality, but
sure.
how they perceived like gender expression as like a prerequisite to queerness or like expressing your sexuality. So
Right.
they thought that it's because I also happen to like girls that I wanted to transition to be a man, which at face value, I was like, what? Right? It's one of those things where it's like, oh, that's not. But like, I think after really reflecting on it and also like, taking like gender theory class in college and like
Mm,
understanding more about a lot of things in regards to intersectionality, I can kind of see where they're coming from, right? Especially if a lot of the media that they're exposed to, and I guess a lot of Asian people who are might be in the older generations are exposed to, it's usually very limited to certain areas of queer identity. I
mm,
think they see a lot of like gay characters in film, for example,
right.
or like trans women represented in screen, which is also the reason why my parents were confused because they thought if you're trans, you have to be like transitioning from
Mm,
biologically or like
right.
assigned male at birth to
Hmm.
female. Um, but I think it's just that, like, seeing that on media and assuming that there's only a couple aspects of identity that exist and that you can fit into the boxes of. I think that was probably one of the biggest, like, I guess, cultural misunderstanding of gender when it comes to my own community.
Wow. Yeah. And then just being there with them to unpack that, to make those distinctions, which for many can feel fairly academic, right? Where it's like, okay,
Yeah.
what this and then this, and it's different from that. And especially for many, it's kind of all folded in together. And so just to untangle it a bit to show the different slices. And to be fair, too, we've had the LGBTQ community kind of operating together for better or for worse. And,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
so
there's that.
the public just looks at the whole community as like they're doing the
Mhm.
same thing or having the same experiences. But, um,
Right.
there is a distinction there that is important to kind of untangle, and also interesting to hear how media plays a role in that misunderstanding, where people can, you know, just have one view to particular identities, particular, I would say, especially trans women, where those
Mhm.
are kind of overrepresented, usually very negatively, sadly,
Right.
in media, even today, I would say. Hopefully that can get better.
Mhm.
And so then not only is it hard for trans masculine people to see themselves, but it's also hard for families to understand where it's like, that's a thing? Question mark.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was like surprising to me too because my parents and like most people in China know of this really famous talk show host who's a trans woman.
Mm,
And
mm,
like her name is I think it's Jing Xing and she's like very like famous. She's acted in shows.
mm,
She's like has her own talk show and she's a trans woman and people accept that and they like, Chinese people accept that as a part of culturally as a part of like someone that's very important. So I thought that was surprising
huh,
because like if people accept the trans woman, into culture, into media, then why not like other areas of queer identity, right?
mm,
Like why is it so hard to understand, I guess, the flip side of it for me, for example, as a trans guy?
yeah.
So I think that was one of those things that I did think a little bit more about when it came to like coming out to my parents and like having conversations with them, in the years
Mm,
afterwards as well about my identity because it is interesting to think about how there might be representation of transgender identity
mm,
even if it's like in widely accepted media, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will be able to like be accepted.
mm, mhm. Wow, that's really interesting. And I'm glad to hear that's happening. And of course, it shows that there's a need to go further, right? And
Yeah,
maybe you need to have your own talk show. That'd be funny. Of course, you don't have to do all the representation work. You've done your heavy lifting.
yeah.
But this does present to me a really interesting question, especially since just a few times we've mentioned, kind of alluded to this kind of big elephant in the room of what's happening in the United States, but also in pockets of Canada. Things are getting tough, and really alarming changes are happening, especially
Mhm.
south of the or not south of the border for you. It's you're in it. Um,
Yeah, it can be scary being here right now. I'll be
I
real.
can imagine, and I'm just curious, like, how's that going for you? I mean, to the
Mhm.
degree you want to talk about it, and you don't have to if you don't want to.
Yeah.
Just appreciate that is a heavy burden to witness and to be a part of.
For sure. I think like I didn't really take it all in right at the end of like me and my friend's election watch party. I think it
Mm,
really came like once Trump really came into office, where a
yeah.
lot of the executive orders, for example, especially those targeting trans women and trans people came into light. It was one of those moments where I kind of, would go on the White House website and
Mm,
find that bill exactly there that made me realize how terrible all this was
mm,
going to be. And of course, like everything that's currently ongoing in terms of, taking away access to gender affirming care for minors, all of the
yeah.
bathroom bans. And all those things are more impactful to like southern states and more Republican states, however. So
Sure.
I'm really glad that although PA, like Pennsylvania, did swing right this election,
Right.
Philadelphia in of itself is a pretty liberal space. So I feel like I'm in this protected bubble
Mm,
where I don't really see the effects of a lot of these like a lot of this legislation that is going out right now, and of course are being contested in court, but are
sure.
still very prevalent in the states right now. So it's weird kind of
Yeah.
being here in Philly while like I see the news every day where I see like trans friends from other states talking about perhaps bans and blockages to a lot of civil rights and liberties that they have. So
Yeah.
it can be really scary though, considering things like travel bans, for example. I know
Mhm.
that recently, um, I think there was like I forgot what it was called. I think it was a memo that was drafted about trans people entering the states. It was
Mm,
targeted to trans athletes. So the
yes.
state, like the US, the Trump administration doesn't want trans women, especially, to come into the states and participate in sports competitions.
Right.
However, the memo is very broad in its language. So there's some fears
Hmm.
from like political scientists and activists and theorists that this could be more broad in effect, so like you would get questioned at the border, for example,
Mm,
which I think that part for me is the scariest, just thinking about like, you know, I mean, I don't think hopefully this will not happen, and I don't think it necessarily will indefinitely take place, at least right now, but
right.
like potentially seeing like a travel ban just because
Mm,
perhaps the border officers are confused as to why my passport photo and
mm,
sex marker is the way that it is once I like pass
mm,
better. It's just one of those things that I do have in the back of my mind when considering traveling and staying in the US, especially as a student on a visa.
right.
So I think it's one of those things that definitely affect everyone regardless of what state they're in right now.
Hmm. Yeah. So there's like a real tangible aspect for you, and then
Yeah.
also witnessing, what's happening in the country,
Mhm.
even if you're in a particular area. Philadelphia, I spent some time there as well. I went to university at Bryn Mawr College, so I'm
Ooh.
sure you're familiar. Add another layer to the whole dynamic. Uh, Whenever I tell people who know what Bryn Mawr is, which are an all women's college, they're like, "Oh, I didn't realize it went co-ed," and I was like,
Yeah. Not really, but
"How much do I want to get into it?" Sure,
yeah.
went co-ed. Um, but all that to say, yes, I mean, I appreciate the kind of all the different layers that you're just kind of always trying to think about it, and it is in the back of the mind or even in the front of the mind of like how to what to do about it, if there's you have to spring into action to address anything that may come up. It's just a huge degree of uncertainty, so
Yeah.
just constantly looking at the status of things, and also appreciating that sometimes people in Canada can be inspired what's happening in the US, and making sure what's coming across the border is also addressed.
Hmm.
But it is a very frightening time, and I'm a dual citizen, so U.S. Canadian, and so very much calling and writing letters and responding to things that are coming up, so that people are aware this is not the direction that is helpful, not just for trans folks, but for all
Hmm.
of society. So it's a big moment.
Yeah, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
And that does get me thinking about, you know, talking to folks and the unique position that you have, or even myself. I come from a very conservative family, and I think about the skills that we've developed, whether we wanted to or not.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've thought about that. Like you, in some sense, are a go-between between new ways or different ways of understanding, and your cultural context and your family, and whether that's now applicable to talking to other folks who, they may have hesitations, they're confused, they don't understand. I don't know if you've thought about that, or if you've even found yourselves in
Mm.
situations where you're leveraging that skill set from your situation
Yeah.
and applying it in different ones.
No, I feel like I'm pretty grateful that I'm kind of like a piece of representation, or like, the bridge between my family
Mhm.
and, their conservative cultural values and these like progressive ideas that I hold, because, they impact people like us.
Mhm.
I think there definitely have been instances where I felt that gratefulness to be able to talk to people, because I think especially once I passed more and I surrounded myself with more male friends,
Mhm.
it was one of those things where I feel like them knowing me as a trans guy, like, allowed them to see trans people as just like regular folks, because
Mhm.
really that's kind of what I was,
Mhm.
even if we don't really focus on these conversations and like kind of address the elephant in the room in of itself. Like, they have that understanding that I'm trans, and all my friends do. So I think it's nice that people at least have one trans person in their lives to, recognize as like a peer, even if we don't
Yeah.
always like address very like heavy and political conversations. I think that's valuable, and it was I do appreciate how I became like more open as a result of coming from my pretty conservative family,
Mhm.
because I feel like more open minded to take in perspectives and to, you know, raise my voice if there's a time and a place for that. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that's wonderful too, that, just going about your everyday life and connecting with folks in your life allows them a view to one, there can be unique challenges, right? The fact that you're
Mhm.
having to listen to all this news and figure out what's happening, but that there is that there's nothing really. I mean, for some people, being trans is strange, right? But once
Mhm.
you get a front row seat to what it actually is, it's like, oh yeah, you're
Yeah,
just
he's just a guy. Like, he's
yeah,
just there.
like actually maybe
Yeah.
even boring. I'll speak for myself. I'm boring. Once people see that, because it counters the perhaps stereotype that's in their head, and then they get to finally see what it actually is about, and just be with that person. There's a lot of power in that, and it's really
Yeah.
wonderful to see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think especially like because there's so much negative visibility now,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
people see only the most extreme sides of, I mean, every community, but
Yeah.
especially when it comes to like the current, attacks on trans people in media, that are very mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
People usually see like a very extreme side to the trans community, or like they see it in a very heavily negative light that makes them scared or not
Yeah.
wanting to approach trans people, even if they don't realize that they, know trans people in their own lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so true. It's interesting. For me, it's with having a fairly conservative family, there's certain things that I've already heard that, when
Yeah.
spoken by other folks, they don't jar me that much.
Mhm.
It's not to say that they're not great, right? Like, I'm not condoning what people are saying, but more that it doesn't fluster me to where I can be present with that person. And
Mm.
depending on my energy level that day, I may continue to stay in dialogue with somebody. Um, but that's, it's not something I wish upon myself, because, some of the things are not that great. But there is a power in being able to just be present with wherever somebody is at, and not get disjointed by it, to be able to help them, possibly, maybe not,
Yeah.
with going further. So it's
Definitely a
interesting.
skill to
Yeah.
build. Yeah.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I have one more question just to close out our fantastic episode so far, and it's just really thinking about the future, and if you like have hopes and dreams for, the future generations of trans individuals who are Chinese or Asian more broadly, and what you kind of would love for yourself and for them.
Yeah, I think that mostly comes down to two things. And the first is like being able to feel more comfortable talking with family.
Mm,
Because I feel like the loss of community is definitely a very big fear that queer Asian friends of mine also have,
mm,
where it is obviously very difficult for everyone, but especially when there's so many like Confucius traditional values, it becomes difficult to, directly, as I mentioned before, like cut yourself off
mm,
from a community that means so much to you. So I hope that in the future, like trans Asian folks can feel more comfortable connecting with their family members, even if there are still going to be like conflicting perspectives and views when it comes to identity. I think that's probably like my biggest hope for the future, although probably like a very long term hope
mm,
for future generations. I think the second thing is like I really hope that there becomes more positive visibility. I know that like right now, of course, there's a lot of negative sentiment, especially in media,
mm,
and especially that also means that like less visible minorities like trans Chinese people obviously do not get as much like
mm,
representation wherever. So I hope that there is going to be more representation for like other intersecting minorities, for queer BIPOC people in media, for like more trans and non-binary Asian people to be
mm,
able to like be in mainstream, be like Chella Man and act in films, or be like Jin Xing in China and like literally have her own talk show, right? It's
mm,
those really big things, or even something small like being in a YouTube video or recording like your transition process. Just having that visibility, I think, is something that I hope to see more of in the future, especially because I think it's one of those things that compels queer youth to really see themselves and also feel more comfortable in being who they are. So
mm.
I think those are my 2 cents.
Mm, I love that so much, and of course, I'm also really grateful for your visibility. As I mentioned, it's a big decision, and of course, I'm sure much went into it, but it means a lot and is really important. And I'm sure, even if you don't hear all the stories, you've impacted so many people to help them, with their own families. So, hats off to you, and thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for coming on this episode to celebrate Asian Heritage Month and beyond.
Yeah.
Of course, not just 1 month, but the whole year. And of course, I wish you all the best as you continue your studies at UPenn. And I'll be definitely monitoring and thinking, among others, about what's happening down in the US, and we'll do all that we can to make sure things are good, not just for you, but of course for all other trans and non-binary folks who find themselves in the US. So,
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
yeah, it was really good to chat, and we'll close it from here. So, bye for now.